Emily Walker walked into a retired K9 auction at Fairhaven Point with only $3,000 in her pocket and one name trembling on her lips. Everyone else came to buy protection. She came to bring home a ghost. At the end of 2 steel leashes stood Ranger, the most dangerous retired police dog in the county, scarred, muzzled, and broken by the day his handler drowned saving 3 children from the Greystone River. The bidding was almost over. Then Emily stepped past the safety line. Ranger lunged, the guards shouted, and just before tragedy struck, she whispered the name of her father, Captain Daniel Walker. What happened next silenced every dog in the auction house. If this story touches your heart today, please share it with someone you care about. Don't forget to subscribe and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the story. On a gray Saturday morning in Fairhaven Point, the county's retired K9 auction opened inside an old brick warehouse near the edge of town. The building had once stored fishing equipment and winter road salt, back when Fairhaven Point still smelled more like river mud and pine lumber than paved parking lots and security cameras. Now the warehouse carried a different kind of weight. Steel kennels lined the far wall. Folding chairs faced a raised platform. A long table near the entrance held clipboards, bidder numbers, and a coffee pot that had been warming too long. Outside, the sky hung low and pale over the town. A cold wind moved through the streets and pushed dead leaves along the curb. Beyond the roofs, the Greystone River ran quietly behind the old mill district, looking calm from a distance, as if it had never taken anything precious from anyone. Inside the warehouse, the sound was restless. Dogs barked from behind the holding area. Some barked sharply, full of training and old duty. Others whined in short, confused bursts. Their paws scraped against concrete. Their tags clicked against collars. Every few seconds, a handler called a command, and the noise lowered for a moment before rising again like a storm that could not decide whether to break. The auction happened once a year. Officially, it was called the Fairhaven County Retired K9 Placement Sale. The name made it sound gentle, almost charitable. In truth, most of the people who came were not looking for pets. They were security company owners, private trainers, ranch managers, and men who wanted dogs with strong jaws and sharper instincts. Some spoke quietly into phones. Some checked papers in leather folders. Some looked at the kennels the way farmers looked at equipment. Emily Walker did not belong among them. She was 21 years old, a diner waitress who had worked double shifts for almost 2 years and saved every spare dollar she could. She stepped through the front doors just after the registration table opened, wearing worn jeans, plain boots, and a faded denim jacket that was too large in the shoulders. The jacket had belonged to her father. Captain Daniel Walker had worn it on his days off, usually over a flannel shirt, usually with Ranger walking beside him. It still carried the faint smell of cedarwood soap and the old garage behind their house. Emily had almost left it in the closet that morning, afraid it would make her weak. Instead, she put it on because some part of her needed to feel as if her father had walked in with her. In her left hand, she held a small manila envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for a little over $3,000. It was all she had. Rent money, grocery money, a small college fund she had never quite started, tips from tired truckers, Sunday families, and elderly couples who always ordered coffee with extra cream. Every dollar had been folded away for one purpose: Ranger, the German Shepherd K9 who had once slept at the foot of her father's chair, the dog who had ridden in the back of Daniel Walker's patrol vehicle for years, the dog who had known the sound of Daniel's boots, the rhythm of his breathing, and the exact tone of his voice when danger was near. Emily approached the registration table and tried to keep her hands steady. A middle-aged county clerk named Marcia Bell looked up from a stack of forms. Marcia was in her 50s, with reading glasses hanging from a silver chain, and the careful manner of someone who had worked public events long enough to expect trouble before lunch. She gave Emily a quick glance, then looked past her as if waiting for an adult to step forward. "Are you here to observe?" Marcia asked. Emily swallowed. "No, ma'am. I'm here to bid." Marcia's expression changed only a little, but Emily noticed it, the small pause, the polite concern, the way her eyes moved from Emily's young face to the old denim jacket, then down to the envelope. "You understand these are retired working dogs," Marcia said gently. "Some are not suited for ordinary homes." "I understand. There are rules. No approaching the dogs without approval. No touching the kennels. No interrupting a handler during presentation." "I understand," Emily repeated. Marcia slid a form across the table. "Name?" "Emily Walker." The clerk's pen stopped, only for a second, but Emily saw it. In Fairhaven Point, the Walker name still opened doors, lowered voices, and made older people remove their hats at memorial ceremonies. Captain Daniel Walker had served the town for more than 20 years. He had been the kind of police officer people remembered, not because he was loud, but because he always came when someone called. He had found lost children, calmed frightened families, sat with widows after break-ins, and once carried an injured golden retriever 3 miles through snow because the owner was too old to lift him. And then, 3 years ago, he had died saving 3 children from the Greystone River. Marcia looked at Emily again, softer this time. "Daniel Walker's daughter?" Emily nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." The clerk said nothing for a moment. Then she reached for a plastic bidder card and wrote a number across it, her voice lowered. "You be careful today, honey." Emily took the card. "I will." She moved away from the table and found a seat near the middle aisle, close enough to see the platform, far enough not to be noticed too much. That was what she hoped, at least. But the room had a way of noticing anything that did not fit. A young woman alone, clutching an envelope, wearing grief like an old coat, was not easy to miss. Near the front row stood a tall man in a dark green field jacket, speaking to 2 handlers. His name was Victor Kane, a 48-year-old owner of Kane Protective Services, a private security company that supplied guard dogs to warehouses, construction sites, and wealthy estates across the county. He had a smooth voice and a clean smile that did not reach his eyes. He glanced around the room with the confidence of a man used to buying what others could not afford. Emily recognized him from local newspaper ads. Kane Protective Services had expanded quickly over the last few years. People said Victor was smart. People also said he never paid more kindness than necessary. He looked briefly in Emily's direction, then dismissed her. That should have relieved her. Instead, it made the envelope in her hand feel smaller. The first dogs were brought out shortly after 9. A retired tracking Labrador with tired eyes went to a search and rescue trainer. A Dutch Shepherd with a stiff back leg was purchased by a ranch owner. A black German Shepherd who still moved like a soldier brought several strong bids from 2 security firms. The auctioneer spoke fast, and the numbers rose faster than Emily had feared. 5,000, 7,000, 9,000. Her stomach tightened each time. She looked down at her bidder card and then at the envelope. $3,000 had felt like a fortune when she was counting it at the kitchen table. Here, among polished boots, business accounts, and men who bought dogs the way others bought trucks, it felt almost childish. Still, she did not leave. She had promised herself she would not leave until she had seen Ranger. For 3 years after her father's funeral, Emily had asked about him. At first, the answers had been kind. Ranger was still needed. Ranger was being reassigned. Ranger was doing important work. Then the answers became shorter. Files were transferred. Calls went unanswered. People told her it was complicated. But grief has a long memory, and love is stubborn in a way paperwork never understands. 2 weeks earlier, an old friend of her father's had called her late in the evening. His name was Tom Bradley, a 64-year-old retired police sergeant who had served with Daniel for nearly 15 years. His voice had sounded rough with guilt when he told her Ranger had been pulled from service and placed on the auction list. "He's not doing well, Em," Tom had said. "But if anyone still has a chance of reaching him, it might be you." Now Emily sat in the warehouse, hearing dogs bark behind the wall, wondering if Ranger knew she was there. Across the room, in the last row near a side exit, an elderly woman watched her quietly. Margaret Ellis was 72 years old, a retired elementary school librarian with silver hair tucked neatly beneath a soft blue scarf. She had come alone, leaning on a wooden cane with a brass handle. Most people assumed she was there by mistake, perhaps waiting for someone, or attending out of curiosity. But Margaret had not entered that warehouse by accident. She had seen the small notice about the auction in the county bulletin. She had seen the list of dogs. When she read the name Ranger, her hand had trembled so badly she had to sit down. Margaret knew that name. Her grandson, Noah Ellis, had been 7 years old on the day the Greystone River rose after 3 days of rain. He had been one of the 3 children who slipped from the muddy bank and vanished into the current. Margaret still remembered the phone call, the sound of her daughter crying, the sirens passing her house, and the terrible walk toward the river when every step felt like it might break her. She remembered Daniel Walker running into the water. She remembered Ranger barking at the bank, then leaping after him. Most of all, she remembered Noah coughing river water into a blanket, alive because a police captain had spent the last strength in his body bringing children back to shore. Since then, Margaret had carried gratitude like a stone in her pocket. Quiet, heavy, always there. When Emily gave her name at the registration table, Margaret had heard it. Walker. The name passed through her like a church bell. Now she studied the young woman in the oversized denim jacket and saw, not just Daniel's daughter, but a child who had also been left on the riverbank that day. A different kind of orphan. One the town had not fully known how to comfort. Emily did not notice Margaret watching. Her eyes were fixed on the platform. The auctioneer cleared his throat and turned a page on his clipboard. Next group will include special case K9s, he announced. These animals require experienced handlers, secure environments, and approved transport. Bidders are reminded that county liability ends at transfer. A few men sat straighter. Victor Kane smiled faintly. Emily's fingers closed around the envelope. Somewhere behind the steel door, a dog let out a deep, broken bark that cut through every other sound in the building. It was older, rougher, and lower than the rest, but Emily knew it in her bones before her mind could catch up. Her breath stopped. That was Ranger. And for the first time that morning, the old denim jacket on her shoulders no longer felt like comfort. It felt like a promise she might not be strong enough to keep. Years before, Fairhaven Point was known as the kind of town where people still waved to one another from pickup trucks, where neighbors remembered birthdays without checking calendars, and where children rode bicycles until the streetlights came on. It was not a wealthy town, but it carried a quiet pride. People trusted each other. More importantly, they trusted one man to appear whenever life suddenly went wrong. His name was Captain Daniel Walker. For more than 20 years, Daniel served with the Fairhaven Point Police Department. He was not famous beyond the county, and he never tried to be. To the people who lived there, he was simply the officer who always arrived with calm instead of panic. He believed that wearing a badge meant protecting people on their worst day, whether the emergency was large enough to make the evening news or small enough that only one lonely family would ever remember it. Daniel began most mornings before sunrise. Long before the station became busy, he could usually be found walking through the quiet streets with Ranger beside him. Store owners unlocking their doors greeted them by name. Children waiting for the school bus often reached down to pat Ranger's head after asking permission. Ranger accepted every greeting with quiet discipline, never breaking formation unless Daniel gave a soft command that meant work could wait for a moment. The German Shepherd had become almost as recognizable as Daniel himself. Everyone in Fairhaven Point knew Ranger. The mail carrier joked that Ranger inspected every mailbox in town. The owner of the hardware store always kept a biscuit behind the counter. Elderly residents smiled whenever Ranger walked beside Daniel during neighborhood visits because the dog's steady presence somehow made ordinary mornings feel safer. Daniel never encouraged people to think of Ranger as a hero. "He just does his job," he often said. But everyone could see something different. Ranger was never simply following commands. He watched Daniel constantly, anticipating movements before words were spoken. If Daniel stopped to help someone carry groceries, Ranger quietly positioned himself between traffic and the sidewalk. If Daniel knelt to comfort a frightened child after a bicycle accident, Ranger lowered himself beside the child without making a sound, offering silent reassurance that seemed almost human. The bond between them had been built over years of patrols, difficult arrests, long nights, and countless hours of training. Neither needed many words anymore. One autumn afternoon, Daniel and Ranger responded to a report of a missing 8-year-old boy who had wandered into the woods beyond Miller Farm. Several deputies joined the search, but daylight faded quickly beneath heavy clouds. Ranger caught the boy's scent within minutes and led Daniel through dense brush, across fallen trees, and into a narrow ravine where the frightened child sat crying beside a stream after twisting his ankle. Daniel carried the boy all the way back, while Ranger walked beside them, checking the surrounding woods every few seconds. The boy's father hugged Daniel so tightly that both men nearly lost their balance. Daniel simply smiled. "Thank Ranger," he said. He found him. Another winter evening, Daniel answered a welfare check for an elderly widow named Eleanor Brooks, an 81-year-old retired music teacher who lived alone outside town. Snow had blocked her driveway, and no one had seen her for 2 days. Daniel forced open the frozen front door and discovered Eleanor weak but conscious after suffering a fall. While paramedics treated her, Ranger remained quietly beside the frightened woman, allowing her trembling hand to rest against his neck until she felt calm enough to leave in the ambulance. Months later, Eleanor told everyone at church that 2 angels had rescued her that night. One wore a police badge, she laughed. The other had 4 paws. Stories like those spread naturally through Fairhaven Point. Daniel never kept count, neither did Ranger. Then came the storm that changed everything. It began with 3 days of relentless rain. Gray clouds swallowed the sun, gutters overflowed, fields disappeared beneath standing water. The Greystone River, usually peaceful enough for fishing boats and children skipping stones, rose higher every hour. The current grew faster, darker, and far more dangerous than most people realized. Emergency crews closed several riverside roads, but children often believed warnings belonged to adults, not to them. Late Saturday afternoon, dispatch received several frantic calls at once. 3 children had slipped from the muddy riverbank near Hawthorne Footbridge. Daniel was the closest unit. He acknowledged the call before the dispatcher even finished speaking. Ranger immediately stood inside the patrol vehicle, sensing urgency from Daniel's voice. When they reached the river, chaos had already taken over. Parents screamed from the bank. Neighbors pointed toward the rushing water. Several people had thrown ropes, but the current carried them far beyond reach. Daniel saw 3 small heads appearing and disappearing between waves. There was no time to wait for rescue boats. He removed only his duty belt and radio, handing them to a deputy who had just arrived. "Watch, Ranger," Daniel said. But before anyone could answer, he was already running. The cold water struck like ice. Daniel fought through the current one powerful stroke at a time. He reached the youngest child first, a frightened little girl barely able to keep her head above water. He wrapped one arm around her and fought back toward shore, while another deputy waded forward to receive her. Daniel turned immediately. He never paused to catch his breath. The second child had drifted farther downstream. By now, the river was moving with frightening force. Tree branches and broken fence posts rushed past like battering rams. Daniel caught the boy just as another wave rolled over both of them. For a terrifying moment, they disappeared beneath the muddy water before Daniel emerged again, pulling the child against his chest. People on shore cheered when they reached dry ground. Daniel did not hear them. He was already looking back toward the river. One child remained. No one could clearly see where the third child had gone. Then Ranger barked, one sharp bark. He stared downstream toward a cluster of partially submerged rocks. Daniel followed the dog's gaze. There, a small hand reached above the water. Daniel ran again. Several deputies shouted for him to stop. One firefighter arriving with Engine 4 yelled that rescue divers were only minutes away. Daniel never slowed. The child did not have minutes. He plunged back into the Greystone River. The current was stronger now than it had been only moments earlier. Daniel reached the boy and lifted him high enough to breathe. Every step toward shore became harder. His legs slipped against unseen rocks. Water slammed into his chest. Still, he refused to let go. People on shore formed a human chain. 2 deputies stretched forward until they caught the child. The boy was pulled safely onto land. Parents rushed forward, crying with relief. For one brief second, everyone believed the danger had passed. Then someone screamed. Daniel was no longer standing. The exhausted officer had lost his footing. The river caught him before anyone could reach him. He tried once to regain balance. The current spun him sideways. Then it carried him away. "Daniel!" The cry echoed across the riverbank. Without waiting for a command, Ranger broke free. The German shepherd launched into the raging water with complete determination. He swam harder than anyone believed possible, fighting waves nearly twice his height. Several times he disappeared beneath the surface before climbing back through the current. At last, he reached Daniel. Ranger caught the sleeve of Daniel's heavy jacket between his teeth and pulled with every ounce of strength left in his body. For one impossible moment, it looked as though the effort might work. People on shore threw ropes. Deputies rushed along the riverbank. But the swollen Greystone River had become too powerful. Another surge slammed into both man and dog. Daniel's grip slipped away. The current separated them. Ranger fought desperately to reach him again, paddling until his movement slowed from exhaustion. Two firefighters finally entered the water downstream and managed to pull Ranger onto shore. The dog struggled wildly, trying to return to the river. He barked again and again toward the rushing water. Not with anger, not with fear, but with desperate refusal to leave his partner behind. Search teams continued through the evening. Floodlights illuminated both riverbanks long after darkness settled over Fairhaven Point. Families remained together in silent prayer. Children held their parents' hands. No one wanted to believe the river had already made its choice. The next morning, church bells rang before sunrise. Fairhaven Point did not need an official announcement. The silence itself carried the truth. The town had lost its captain. The man who had given everything to save 3 children would never walk its streets again. Outside the police station, patrol cars lined the parking lot with their lights flashing quietly. Flowers appeared beneath the department sign before anyone asked people to bring them. Candles filled the sidewalks by evening. And beside Daniel's empty patrol vehicle sat Ranger. The German shepherd refused food. He stared toward the road, as if waiting for one familiar pair of boots to appear around the corner. No command came, no footsteps followed, only the wind moved through Fairhaven Point, carrying grief into every home that Captain Daniel Walker had ever protected. After Daniel's funeral, Fairhaven Point tried to return to its ordinary rhythm, but ordinary things no longer felt the same. The patrol cars still moved through town, the bakery still opened before sunrise, the school buses still rolled past the river road. Yet everywhere Emily looked, there seemed to be a space where her father should have been. His chair at the kitchen table stayed empty. His boots remained by the back door. His coffee mug sat untouched in the cabinet because neither Emily nor her mother had the heart to move it. Ranger felt the absence in a way no one could explain. For 3 days after the funeral, he stayed near Daniel's patrol vehicle behind the police station. Officers tried to lead him inside. He obeyed for a few minutes, then returned to the vehicle and lay beside the driver's door, watching the parking lot with tired, fixed eyes. He did not understand speeches, folded flags, or official condolences. He understood scent, footsteps, routine, and command. Daniel's scent was fading. Daniel's footsteps did not come. Daniel's voice no longer gave the word to rest. Emily visited the station on the 4th morning. She was still pale from grief, wearing the same black dress from the funeral beneath an old coat. Her mother, Linda Walker, a 47-year-old former school secretary who had spent years holding the family together during Daniel's long shifts, waited in the car because she could not bear to walk past the memorial flowers again. Emily found Ranger lying near the patrol vehicle. When he saw her, his ears lifted. For one bright second, hope seemed to pass through him. Then he smelled the air, searched behind her, and lowered his head again when Daniel did not appear. Emily knelt on the cold pavement and pressed her forehead against Ranger's neck. "I know," she whispered. "I keep looking for him, too." That same day, Emily asked the department to let her take Ranger home. The answer came from Chief Harold Benton, a 58-year-old police chief who had served as Daniel's supervisor and friend for many years. Benton was a careful man, not unkind, but trained by rules that did not bend easily. He invited Emily into his office, where Daniel's framed commendation still hung on the wall. "I wish it were simple," Benton said. Emily sat across from him, with Ranger's leash folded in her hands. "He was Dad's partner. He already knows our house. He knows me." "I know that." "Then let him come home." Benton looked down at his desk. "Ranger is still county property. He is an active K-9 asset until the board retires him or reassigns him. There are evaluations, liability rules, handler requirements." Emily stared at him. "He is not a chair or a radio." "No," Benton said softly. "He is not." But the answer remained no. Ranger was placed under temporary care at the County K-9 facility. At first, the plan was simple. Give him time. Let him grieve. Then assign him to another qualified handler. Working dogs, the department believed, often recovered when structure returned. But Ranger did not recover. His first reassignment was to Deputy Mark Ellison, a 32-year-old K-9 officer from a neighboring district. Ellison was patient, experienced, and respectful of Daniel's memory. He did not rush the dog. He used calm commands, slow routines, and careful distance. Ranger obeyed the basic signals when he had to, but there was no connection in it. He performed like a machine with a missing gear. His eyes kept searching past Ellison, toward doorways, hallways, and empty roads. During one evening training session, Ellison led Ranger near a drainage canal behind the facility. Rainwater rushed through the concrete channel with a hollow, echoing sound. Ranger stopped so suddenly that the leash snapped tight. His body lowered, his breathing changed. Before Ellison could redirect him, Ranger lunged toward the water, barking with a force that shook his entire body. It was not aggression, it was panic. Ellison pulled him back, but Ranger fought the leash as if someone had vanished beneath the surface. He clawed at the wet ground. He ignored commands. He did not seem to see the deputy at all. After that, reports began to collect in Ranger's file. High stress response to running water, failure to bond with new handler, night agitation, unpredictable reaction during river-adjacent patrol. The second reassignment went worse. A handler from a larger city unit tried to use firmer discipline, believing Ranger needed a strong command presence. Ranger resisted him from the start. He refused to enter the cruiser. He turned away from food rewards. During a search drill near a park fountain, the sound of water striking stones sent him into another frantic episode. When the handler grabbed his collar too sharply, Ranger snapped and caught the man's sleeve. No one was seriously injured, but the report was enough. After that, Ranger was no longer treated like a grieving partner. He was treated like a risk. Emily kept calling. Sometimes Marcia Bell answered at the county office and promised to leave messages. Sometimes Chief Benton spoke to her himself, his voice growing heavier each time. "We are still reviewing options," he would say. "He is being cared for." Emily wanted to believe him, but then Tom Bradley came to see her. It was late evening, nearly 2 weeks before the auction. Emily was closing the diner, wiping down the last table while rain tapped against the front windows. Tom stepped inside after the sign had been turned to closed. He removed his hat and stood near the door like a man carrying news he wished belonged to someone else. Emily knew before he spoke. "What happened?" she asked. Tom took a breath. "It's Ranger." She gripped the edge of the table. "He's being retired from service," Tom said. "Officially." Emily closed her eyes. For a moment, relief almost came. Retired meant no more handlers, no more forced patrols. Maybe now they would let him come home. Then Tom looked away. "There's more," he said. The county had placed Ranger on the list for the Fairhaven Point's retired K-9 auction. Because of his age, his trauma responses, and the bite report, he was not approved for normal adoption. He would be sold only to licensed security buyers, specialized facilities, or approved private handlers willing to assume risk. Emily's voice went thin. "They are selling him?" Tom nodded once. "I tried to stop it. Did Chief Benton know?" "He knows. He does not like it." But the board made the call. They say the department cannot keep a dog it cannot deploy, and they cannot release him to a family without liability clearance. Emily turned away, pressing both hands against her mouth. Tom stepped closer. "Listen to me, Em. I should have told you sooner. I kept thinking I could fix it quietly. I thought I could convince someone." "When is it?" "Saturday morning." The rain against the windows sounded suddenly louder. Emily looked toward the dark street beyond the glass. Somewhere in town, beyond the old mill road and the county facility, Ranger was still waiting for a voice that would never come back. Her father had given his life pulling 3 children from the Greystone River. Ranger had nearly given his life trying to pull Daniel home. And now, the last living witness to that love was being passed from one stranger to another. "How much money do I need?" Emily asked. Tom's face tightened. "Maybe more than you have." "How much?" "I do not know." She untied her apron with shaking hands. "Then I will bring everything." Tom reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded paper on the table. It was the auction notice, with Ranger's listing circled in blue ink. Lot 37, German Shepherd, male, 8 years old, former police K-9, special handling required. Emily stared at the words until they blurred. To the county, Ranger had become a listing. To Emily, he was the last heartbeat left from a home that had already lost too much. That night, she opened the small metal box under her bed and counted every dollar she had saved. Tips, birthday money, emergency cash. A cashier's check she had been afraid to spend on anything because spending it made the future feel smaller. By morning, she had a little over $3,000. Not enough, perhaps. But grief had already taken her father. She would not let it take Ranger quietly, too. By the time Lot 37 was called, Emily had already watched enough dogs leave the platform to understand how little her money could do in that room. Each bid rose with a speed that made her chest tighten. Men lifted bidder cards without emotion. A woman from a training center nodded once and added $2,000 as if she were ordering lunch. Every time the auctioneer's gavel struck the block, another retired K9 passed into a future decided by strangers. Emily kept her bidder card in her lap. Her thumb pressed so hard against the plastic edge that it left a pale mark in her skin. The auctioneer was Roy Mercer, a 61-year-old former police dispatcher who now handled county surplus sales and public auctions. He had a practiced voice, clear enough to fill the room without shouting, and the tired patience of a man who had learned to keep moving even when the paperwork felt heavier than the people wanted to admit. He adjusted his glasses, looked down at the next page, and paused. That pause told Emily more than his words did. Roy cleared his throat. Next is Lot 37, male German Shepherd, 8 years old, former Fairhaven Point Police K9, name Ranger. The warehouse changed, not loudly, not in a way someone could point to, but several older men in the room looked up. One handler near the side wall shifted his weight. Margaret lowered her eyes for a moment, as if the name itself deserved respect. Even Victor Kane stopped speaking to the man beside him and turned toward the platform with interest. Behind the steel door, a deep bark sounded again. Emily stopped breathing. 2 handlers stepped out first. One was Luis Ortega, a 39-year-old county K9 trainer responsible for managing high-risk dogs during the auction. The other was Ben Crowley, a 44-year-old animal control officer who had worked with difficult dogs for years. Both men held long restraint leads, and both moved with the careful attention of people who knew a single mistake could turn the room into chaos. Then Ranger appeared. For one painful second, Emily did not recognize him. The dog she remembered had been powerful, proud, and bright-eyed. He had filled the back seat of Daniel's patrol vehicle like a dark guardian angel, one ear always turned toward his handler. He had trotted through the Walker backyard with a rubber ball in his mouth, and a seriousness that made Daniel laugh. This dog looked like the shadow of that memory. Ranger's black and tan coat had dulled with age and stress. Gray touched the fur around his muzzle. A scar crossed one shoulder, hidden in places beneath uneven hair. One ear bore an old tear near the edge. He still had the strong frame of a working German shepherd, but he looked leaner now, his body held tight, as if every muscle expected danger. A heavy leather muzzle covered his snout. His eyes moved across the room quickly, never resting, never trusting. Emily felt the first tear fall before she could stop it. She wiped it away with the heel of her hand, angry at herself for crying so soon. Ranger had not even seen her yet. She wanted to be strong when he did. Luis and Ben guided Ranger to the center of the platform. Ranger resisted only once, turning sharply toward the holding area when another dog barked behind him. Luis gave a quiet correction. Ranger froze, then faced forward again, his chest rising and falling in controlled, uneven breaths. Roy Mercer glanced at the file in front of him. "Full disclosure on this animal," he said. His voice was steady, but softer than before. Ranger served 6 active years with Fairhaven Point Police Department, certified in tracking, suspect apprehension, evidence location, and missing person response. Multiple commendations, assisted in 37 successful searches and 12 high-risk arrests. A few people in the room murmured. Those numbers meant something. Emily looked at Ranger and remembered Daniel's hand resting between his ears. Roy continued. Following the death of his primary handler, Captain Daniel Walker, Ranger was evaluated for reassignment. Records indicate severe stress response, handler rejection, and repeated panic episodes triggered by running water. There is also one confirmed bite incident involving a handler during a training exercise. Victor Kane leaned forward slightly. Roy turned the page. Because of age, trauma history, and handling risk, Ranger is not approved for family placement under standard adoption rules. Recommended placement is secure private property, perimeter work, or specialized facility with experienced handlers. Bidding begins at $1,000. The word struck Emily harder than she expected. Not approved for family placement. Family was the only thing Ranger had left. She raised her bidder card before anyone else moved. 1,000, she said. Her voice came out small but clear. Roy looked toward her and nodded. 1,000 to bidder 14. For a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to hope. The room remained quiet. Several buyers studied Ranger with cool calculation. A dog with trauma could become expensive. A dog that panicked near water required special handling. A dog that had bitten a handler carried risk. Even men who admired strength knew liability when they saw it. Then Victor lifted his card. 2,000. Emily's stomach dropped. Roy nodded. 2,000 to bidder 22. Emily looked at the envelope in her lap. She had expected this. She had feared it. Still, hearing the number spoken aloud made her feel the room tilting beneath her. She lifted her card again. 3,000? Roy glanced at her with something like sympathy. 3,000 to bidder 14. That was nearly all of it. Emily knew she should save a little for transport, food, and whatever care Ranger needed after she brought him home. But there was no future care if she lost him now. Victor turned his head and looked at her properly for the first time. His expression held no anger. That would have been easier to bear. Instead, he looked amused, as if Emily had entered a game without understanding its rules. 4,000, he said. Emily's fingers tightened around the bidder card. She had a little over $3,000. The number in the envelope had been counted 3 times that morning. She could not stretch it by wishing. She could not make tips appear from empty air. She could not ask her mother, who had barely kept their house after Daniel's death, to give what she did not have. Roy waited. Emily tried to speak. Nothing came. 4,000 to bidder 22, Roy said. Do I hear 4,500? The room stayed quiet. Victor smiled faintly. Emily leaned forward. Please, she said, though she was not sure who she was speaking to. Roy heard her. So did Margaret. So did Tom, standing near the side wall with his hat in both hands. Victor raised his card again before anyone else could move. 5,000? A few buyers looked at him with surprise. The price had gone higher than most expected for a dog with Ranger's file. But Victor did not seem concerned. He turned slightly, letting the room see that he had no intention of being challenged by a young woman with a thin envelope and wet eyes. Roy looked uncomfortable now. 5,000 to bidder 22. Emily stared at Ranger. At that moment, Ranger's head turned slightly. Perhaps he had heard her breath catch. Perhaps he had caught some trace of the old denim jacket, faint beneath the warehouse smell of metal, concrete, and anxious dogs. His ears shifted. His eyes moved across the rows, searching. For 1 second, Emily thought he was looking directly at her. Then, Luis tightened the lead, and Ranger faced forward again. Victor spoke to a man beside him, loudly enough for Emily to hear. He will do well at the North Warehouse. High fence, limited contact, no public access. The one by Greystone? The man asked. Victor nodded. Water on one side, rail line on the other. Perfect place for a dog nobody should approach. Emily's heart seemed to stop. The North Warehouse stood near the Greystone River, beside a long stretch of chain-link fence and loading docks. She had passed it many times. You could hear the river from the back lot, especially after rain. The water moved around the concrete pilings with a constant rushing sound. Ranger would hear it every day, every night. He would stand behind a fence listening to the sound of the river that had taken Daniel, while strangers called him dangerous because he could not forget. Emily looked down at her bidder card. It suddenly felt useless. Roy lifted the gavel. 5,000 going once. Tom stepped forward a few inches, then stopped. He did not have that kind of money either. His jaw worked as if he wanted to say something, but the rules of the auction held him in place. Margaret's hand tightened around the brass handle of her cane. Emily's eyes blurred. She could not bear the sight of Ranger on the platform, muzzled and measured and priced, as if the years beside Daniel had been erased by a line on a file. 5,000 going twice, Roy said. Ranger shifted again. This time his gaze found Emily. There was no sudden miracle, no wagging tail, no peaceful recognition. His eyes were too guarded for that. But he stared at the denim jacket, and the muscles along his shoulders trembled. Emily stood before she knew she had made the decision. Her chair scraped against the concrete. Several people turned. Roy paused with the gavel in the air. Emily could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear Ranger breathing through the muzzle. She could hear Victor Kane sigh softly, already irritated by the delay. She had no higher bid. She had no legal argument. She had only a name, a memory, and the terrible knowledge that if she stayed silent, Ranger would be sent back to the sound of the river alone. "Wait," Emily said. Her voice was not loud, but in that room, at that moment, it was enough to stop everything. Roy kept the gavel raised but did not bring it down. The room turned toward her, irritated at first, then curious. Auctions did not pause for feelings. Everyone inside that warehouse knew the rules. Money spoke. The highest bid won. Sentiment had no place on the paperwork. Victor Kane looked over his shoulder with a thin smile. "Unless you have $6,000 hidden in that jacket, this is over." Emily did not answer him. Her eyes stayed on Ranger. The German shepherd stood in the center of the platform, held by Luis and Ben, his body tight beneath the restraint leads. His muzzle was fixed around his snout. His breathing came hard and uneven. He had heard something in Emily's voice, or smelled something in the old denim jacket, because he no longer scanned the room like a dangerous animal looking for an opening. He stared at her with a focus that made everything else seem distant. Roy lowered the gavel slightly. "Miss Walker, I am sorry, but unless you are placing another bid, I need to talk to him." A murmur moved through the buyers. Luis shook his head immediately. "No, absolutely not." Ben tightened his grip on the lead. "He is under restraint for a reason." Emily stepped into the aisle. "He knows me." "No," Luis said. His voice was not cruel, only firm. "He knew your father. That is not the same thing." Those words struck her because a part of her feared they were true. Ranger had known the little girl who waited on the porch with scraped knees and peanut butter on her fingers. He had known Daniel's daughter before grief changed her face, before 3 years of unanswered calls and empty chairs. Maybe Luis was right. Maybe she was only a stranger wearing an old jacket. But Ranger's eyes did not leave her. Roy tried to regain control. "Miss Walker, please return to your seat." Victor sighed. "This is exactly why these sales should be closed to the public." Emily moved before caution could stop her. She stepped past the first row, crossed the narrow space near the platform, and ducked under the safety rope. The reaction was instant. Several buyers stood. Margaret gasped. Tom took one hard step forward. Roy called her name, his voice cracking through the microphone. Luis and Ben pulled back on the leads as Ranger's entire body shifted. The dog exploded into motion. He lunged toward Emily with such force that both handlers staggered. His paws slammed against the wooden platform. The restraint lines snapped tight. A deep, tearing growl rose from his chest, not loud at first, but so full of warning that every person in the room understood the danger. Emily stopped 6 feet away. Her heart beat so hard, she felt it in her throat. Ranger's eyes were dark and wild now. The moment had changed. Whatever fragile thread had connected him to her had been swallowed by instinct, fear, and the brutal training that had once made him useful. He saw movement. He saw a human crossing into forbidden space. He saw a threat before he saw a memory. Luis planted both feet. "Back away slowly." Ben reached toward the emergency catch pole mounted near the platform rail. "Do not move closer." Tom's voice came from behind her. "Emily, listen to them." But Emily could not step back. If she stepped back now, Roy would finish the sale. Victor would take Ranger to the North Warehouse, and every night the dog would hear the Greystone River whispering the worst day of his life through chain-link fencing. Emily had spent 3 years losing pieces of her father, his voice from the hallway, his laugh from the kitchen, his hand on her shoulder when he said everything would be all right, even when it was not. Ranger was the last living piece that still remembered Daniel not as a photograph, not as a memorial plaque, but as a man who breathed, worked, laughed, and loved. She lifted both hands slowly, palms open. Ranger growled harder. The muzzle held his jaws, but the sound behind it was enough to make people step away. Somewhere in the holding area, the other dogs began barking one after another, feeding off the rising fear in the room. Emily looked straight into Ranger's eyes. For a moment, she was a child again, standing in the backyard while Daniel trained after dinner. Ranger had been younger then, all muscle and energy, racing toward Daniel on command, stopping so fast dust lifted around his paws. Daniel's voice had always been calm, not loud, not angry. It carried authority because he never wasted it. Emily remembered the exact rhythm, not just the words, the breath before them, the weight inside them. She drew air into her chest, though it trembled going in. Ranger? The dog jerked slightly. Luis glanced at Ben. Emily spoke again, deeper this time, forcing her voice into the old shape of her father's command. Ranger, stand down for Captain Walker. The growl stopped, not faded, stopped. Ranger froze so completely that the restraint leads went slack in the handler's hands. His ears shifted forward. His body remained tense, but something changed behind his eyes, like a door opening in a house long thought abandoned. No one spoke. Even Victor's smile disappeared. Emily took one small step closer. Stand down, she repeated, softer now. Ranger's chest rose once, then again. His front paws stopped digging into the platform. The wildness in his gaze did not vanish, but it loosened. Beneath it, Emily saw confusion, pain, and something terribly close to recognition. Slowly, Ranger lowered his hindquarters. The most dangerous retired police dog in the county sat down in the middle of the platform. A sound moved through the room, but it was not speech. It was the quiet shock of people watching something they had no category for. Luis stared at the loose lead in his hands. Ben kept one hand near the catchpole but did not touch it. Roy lowered the microphone without realizing he had done it. Behind the steel wall, the barking began to fade. One dog stopped, then another, then another. The sharp chorus that had filled the warehouse all morning collapsed into silence, kennel by kennel, until only the hum of old lights remained above them. It felt as if the entire building had taken a breath and refused to release it. Emily could hear Ranger now, not his growl, his breathing. It came uneven and rough through the muzzle. Then the sound changed. A thin, broken whine rose from his throat. Emily's eyes filled. "Hi, boy," she whispered. Ranger's ears lowered. She took another step, careful and slow. Nobody stopped her this time. They were too stunned, or maybe some part of them understood that this was no longer an auction interruption. It was a reunion happening in a language older than rules. Emily stood just below the platform, close enough to see the gray around Ranger's muzzle and the scar along his shoulder. She remembered him running beside Daniel on summer evenings, remembered his head resting across her father's boots, remembered Daniel telling her that trust was not something a person demanded. It was something they earned and protected. She swallowed against the ache in her throat. "Dad isn't coming back," she said. The words were small, but they carried through the silent room. Ranger whined again. Emily's voice broke, but she did not look away. "I know you waited. I know you looked for him. I did too." Margaret pressed one hand over her mouth. Tom bowed his head. Emily lifted the sleeve of the denim jacket slightly. "This was his," she said. "I wore it because I thought maybe you would remember." Ranger leaned forward. Luis looked at Roy, uncertain. Roy made no command. Emily stepped close enough that Ranger could smell the cuff of the jacket. He stretched his neck as far as the leads allowed. His nose moved over the faded denim. For several seconds, he was utterly still. Then his body shuddered. It began in his shoulders and passed through him like cold leaving stone. The terrible guarded tension drained from his frame. His head lowered. The whine that followed sounded so human, so full of loss, that several people in the front row looked away. Emily reached up but stopped before touching him. She would not take that choice from him. Ranger stared at her hand. Then, slowly, he leaned his muzzled face into her palm. Emily closed her fingers gently around the side of his head. The leather muzzle was cold beneath her hand. His fur was rougher than she remembered, but beneath the scars, beneath the fear, beneath all the years people had called him impossible, he was still Ranger, her father's partner, her family. She looked back toward Roy, toward Victor, toward everyone who had come to measure worth in dollars. "I don't have more money," she said, "but he is not going to that river warehouse." Victor's jaw tightened. "You do not get to decide that." Emily turned back to Ranger and rested her forehead lightly against his muzzle. "Dad isn't coming back," she whispered again, only for him now. "But I'm taking you home." Ranger gave one soft sound in reply. It was not a bark. It was not a command. It was the sound of a broken heart recognizing another broken heart. And for a few sacred seconds, the whole room remained silent enough to hear it. For several seconds after Emily's words faded, no one moved. The old warehouse, which had been built to hold noise, now held silence so complete that even the metal kennels seemed to be listening. Ranger sat on the platform with his muzzled face resting against Emily's palm, and every person in the room seemed to understand that something had shifted. A dog they had been warned to fear had answered a voice from the past. A young woman who had arrived with almost nothing had reached a place money could not touch. Victor broke the silence first. "This is touching," he said, his voice controlled but sharp. "But it changes nothing. The dog is still under auction rules, and my bid is still the highest." Emily did not turn around. Her hand remained against Ranger's head. She could feel the tremor in him, small but constant, like a bridge after a heavy train has passed over it. Roy looked troubled. "Mr. Kane, the sale has not been closed yet." "Then close it." That was when Margaret stood. Her cane touched the concrete with a quiet tap, but it sounded louder than it should have. People turned as the elderly woman stepped out from the last row and began walking slowly down the aisle. She moved with care, not weakness. There was a dignity in her pace that made people shift aside without being asked. Emily looked over her shoulder. Margaret stopped near the front and looked first at Ranger, then at Emily. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "My name is Margaret Ellis," she said, "and I believe this room should know what that dog truly is before anyone calls him property again." Victor exhaled impatiently. "Ma'am, with respect," Margaret turned her head toward him. "Respect is exactly what I came to speak about." The room remained still. Margaret reached into the pocket of her coat and took out a small photograph protected inside a plastic sleeve. The picture showed a boy of about 7, smiling with 2 missing front teeth, his hair still damp, a hospital blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Beside him stood a younger Margaret, one hand resting on his back, her face pale from the kind of fear that does not leave quickly. "This is my grandson, Noah Ellis," she said. "He was one of the 3 children pulled from the Greystone River the day Captain Daniel Walker died." The name Noah moved through the room like a whispered prayer. Emily knew the story, but not the faces. After her father died, the names of the children had been kept mostly private to protect their families. She had never blamed them. They had been children. Her father had made the choice any good man would make. But seeing the photograph made the story painfully real in a new way. The child had not been an idea. He had been a little boy with missing teeth and damp hair, and a life still waiting to be lived. Margaret held the photo against her chest. "Noah is 17 now," she continued. "He is tall, eats more than any reasonable person should, and leaves muddy shoes by the door no matter how many times his mother reminds him. He wants to become a paramedic. He says he wants to help people on the worst day of their lives because someone once did that for him." A few people lowered their eyes. Margaret's mouth trembled, but she kept speaking. "My family has had 10 more Christmas mornings with that boy, 10 more birthdays, school plays, baseball games, ordinary dinners where he complains about vegetables as if broccoli is a personal insult from heaven." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the room, small and tender. Then Margaret looked at Ranger. That ordinary life was bought by Captain Walker in the Greystone River, and it was witnessed by Ranger. Emily felt Ranger shift under her hand. Margaret took another step closer. That dog was not standing safely on shore. He went in after his partner. I saw it. Many of us saw it. He fought that river until the firefighters dragged him out. Even then, he tried to go back. Tom stepped away from the side wall. His face was drawn, and his hat was still clenched in both hands. He had carried guilt quietly for years, but now it seemed to pull him forward. He stopped beside Margaret and looked at Ranger for a long moment before speaking. "She's telling the truth." The room turned toward him. Tom's voice was rough, but clear. "I was on the bank that day. I arrived after Daniel had already pulled the first child out. By the time he went back for the third, the river had turned into something no man should have entered." He swallowed. "Daniel knew the risk. We all knew it. He went anyway." Emily lowered her eyes, and Ranger leaned slightly closer to her leg. Tom continued. When Daniel lost his footing, Ranger broke loose before anyone could stop him. He reached Daniel once, caught his jacket, pulled with everything he had. I have seen strong dogs in my life, but I have never seen an animal fight like that. Not for training, not for reward, for love. No one interrupted now. Even Victor said nothing. Tom looked at the handlers, then at Roy. When the firefighters pulled Ranger back, his paws were bleeding. He kept trying to crawl toward the river. We had to hold him down because he would have drowned himself trying to reach Daniel again. Luis looked at the restraint lead in his hands as if it suddenly weighed more. Ben's face softened. Tom's voice dropped. So when his file says he reacts to running water, understand what that means. He is not hearing water. He is hearing the last place he saw his partner alive. The words settled into the room. Emily closed her eyes for a second. That was the truth no report could carry. A file could say stress response. It could say handler rejection. It could say bite incident. It could not say that grief sometimes takes the shape of a German shepherd, sitting behind a muzzle, waiting for a man who gave his last breath to save children. Margaret turned toward Victor again. You wanted to put him beside the river. Victor's jaw tightened. My facility is secure. It may be secure for your property, Margaret said, but it would be a prison for him. A few buyers murmured in agreement. Victor looked around, realizing the room had changed against him. This is emotional manipulation. No, Tom said, it is context. Roy placed the gavel on the table instead of holding it in the air. His shoulders lowered as if he were finally allowing himself to feel the weight of the day. I knew Daniel, he said quietly. Most of us did. He looked toward Ranger. But the county rules still stand. The dog must be transferred through proper sale or approved placement. Emily looked up. Hope had not returned fully, but something had opened. Not a door yet, maybe only a window. Still, it let air into the room. Margaret walked to Emily and stopped just beyond Ranger's reach. She did not try to touch the dog. She only looked at him with the solemn gentleness of someone recognizing an old soldier. I never got to thank your father properly, she said to Emily. At the hospital, everything was confusion. After the funeral, I brought flowers, but flowers are small things when someone gives you a lifetime. Emily's voice trembled. He would have said he was just doing his job. Margaret smiled through tears. Good men often say that when they have done something holy. Ranger gave a soft whine. Emily looked down at him. The sound was not fear now. It was tiredness. Deep, ancient tiredness, as if he had been standing guard over that river for 3 years and had only just been given permission to lower his head. Tom stepped closer to the platform. Ranger is not finished because he is broken, he said. He is exhausted because he never got to come home. Those words reached places in the room that money had not. A ranch owner in the second row removed his cap. A trainer near the aisle wiped at one eye and pretended to adjust his glasses. Marcia, still near the registration table, pressed the corner of a tissue to her face. The buyers had entered the warehouse seeing dogs as assets, risks, investments, and responsibilities. Now they looked at Ranger and saw something harder to dismiss. He was the last living witness to a sacrifice that had kept 3 families whole. He had not failed his handler. He had survived him. Victor folded his arms. Are we running an auction or a memorial? Roy looked at him for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was still professional, but it had gained a firmness that had not been there before. We are running an auction, Roy said, and everyone here now understands what is being sold. The room stayed quiet. Emily gently lowered her hand from Ranger's face. He followed the movement with his eyes but did not growl. The silence around them no longer felt empty. It felt full of memory, full of Daniel, full of the river and the lives pulled from it. Margaret turned to face the room. Then let us make sure, she said, that Fairhaven Point does not sell its last hero to the highest fence. Victor Kane did not like the way the room had turned against him. He had entered the auction expecting a simple purchase, a strong dog at a reduced price, and perhaps a useful story to tell clients about owning a former police K9. Instead, he stood in a warehouse where strangers now looked at him as if he were trying to buy a memorial wreath and hang it on a fence. He lifted his bidder card again. 6,000, he said. The number landed hard. Emily felt it like a door closing. She still had only the money in her envelope. Margaret's words had changed hearts, but hearts did not complete county transfer forms. Roy looked down at the paperwork, then back at the room. 6,000 to bidder 22, Roy said carefully. Victor's eyes moved to Emily. That is how an auction works. For a moment, no one answered. Then Margaret stepped forward. She opened her purse with slow, steady hands and removed a small white envelope. It was worn at the corners, the kind a person keeps hidden in a dresser drawer for emergencies that have not yet arrived. I have $800, Margaret said. It was meant for repairs to my porch steps. They can wait. I have been careful for 72 years. I can be careful on uneven steps a little longer. A soft laugh moved through the room, warm and tearful. Margaret placed the envelope on Roy's table. Put it with Emily's bid. Roy blinked. Mrs. Ellis, I am not sure the county procedure allows combined. Then write faster and make it allowed, Margaret said. This time, the laughter was stronger. Tom stepped forward next. He reached into his coat and took out a folded check. His hands shook slightly, though his voice did not. I can add 1,200. Emily turned toward him. Tom, no. Yes, he said. I should have fought harder for him 3 years ago. Let an old man correct one mistake before breakfast. He put the check beside Margaret's envelope. Roy looked at the growing pile, uncertain, but moved. That brings the total to 5,000. Emily's breath caught. Still not enough. Victor gave a small smile. Generous, still short. From the second row, a woman stood. Her name was Ruth Bellamy, a 59-year-old bakery owner whose shop had served Fairhaven Point for almost 3 decades. She wore a flour-dusted coat and had the practical face of someone who had been awake since 4 in the morning. Captain Walker once sat outside my bakery for 3 nights after we had a break-in, said no one should have to open their business afraid. I have 500. She came forward and placed folded bills on the table. Behind her rose Frank Dolan, a 66-year-old retired firefighter who had served with Engine 4 on the day of the river rescue. His voice was low. Daniel pulled my younger brother from a wreck on Miller Road in 2009. I have 700. A retired teacher named Helen Price, 70 years old, stood near the aisle. She had taught half the town to read and remembered every child by name. Daniel found one of my students hiding behind the church after his parents fought. He stayed with that boy until midnight. I have 300. One by one, people stood. Not all had much. Some had $50. Some had 100. One ranch manager who had come to buy a working dog offered 200 and said nothing more. A mechanic added cash from his wallet because Daniel had once changed a tire for his wife in freezing rain. Marcia left the registration table and quietly added what she could from her purse. The table changed from an auction desk into something closer to an altar of gratitude. Bills, checks, envelopes, and handwritten promises gathered beside Emily's original cashier's check. Victor's face hardened. This is absurd, he said. You cannot run a sale on pocket change and memories. Roy looked at the money, then at Emily, then at Ranger. For the first time that morning, he seemed less like an auctioneer and more like a man from Fairhaven Point. The combined bid now stands at 6,300, Roy said. A murmur passed through the room. Victor raised his card again. 7,000. The warmth thinned. Emily felt panic return. Before Roy could repeat the number, Frank Dolan spoke again. I can call my union fund. Ruth looked toward the back. My husband is outside with the delivery van. He keeps emergency cash in the glove box. Helen added, the Teachers Association has a memorial account. Daniel spoke at our safety day every year. Tom lifted a hand. Hold on. Let us not make promises we cannot honor today. Margaret looked at Emily. How much more do we need? Emily could barely speak. Too much. No, Margaret said. Only enough. A man near the rear rose slowly. He was Samuel Green, a 68-year-old owner of a small feed store and one of the few buyers in the room who had come prepared to bid seriously. He cleared his throat. I came for a patrol dog for my property. I budgeted $2,000 for it. I can wait another year. He walked forward and placed a check on the table. The room went still again, but this time the silence was full of motion beneath the surface. Roy added the numbers with Marcia's help. His pen moved across the paper. He checked twice. Then he looked up. 7,100. Victor's jaw worked. He looked at the people around him and saw no audience left to impress. Only witnesses. He lifted his card, slower this time. 8,000? Emily closed her eyes. Then Roy spoke before anyone else could. Mister Kane, before I accept that bid, I need to remind all buyers that placement review is still required for special case animals. Given the testimony regarding Ranger's severe response to running water, a riverside warehouse may not meet the welfare standard in the county file. Victor stared at him. You are changing the rules. No, Roy said. I am reading the whole file. Luis nodded from the platform. He is right. That placement would need review. Ben added quietly, and I would not recommend it. Victor looked from Roy to the handlers, then to the crowd. The room had become a wall he could not purchase. At last, he lowered his card. I am done wasting time, he said. No one tried to stop him as he walked toward the exit. His shoes struck the concrete sharply, but the sound faded the moment the door closed behind him. Roy looked around the room. Current combined bid is $7,100 for placement with Emily Walker, pending county transfer approval. No one challenged it. Roy lifted the gavel. Going once. Emily held her breath. Going twice. Margaret reached for Emily's hand. Sold. The gavel struck the block. Emily did not cheer. She covered her mouth as tears came fast and silent. Around her, people exhaled, some wiping their eyes, others nodding as if a wrong thing had finally been set right. Roy stamped the transfer papers with a heavy sound. Ranger is awarded for civilian placement under Emily Walker's custody, with support documentation from Fairhaven County. Luis looked down at Ranger. We still need to move carefully. Emily nodded. I know. The handlers unclipped one restraint first, then the other. The leads fell loose. Ranger remained seated, watching Emily. The muzzle stayed on, but the old fury had drained from his posture. Emily stepped closer, slowly. She knelt on the concrete, just as she had done outside the police station years ago. This time, she did not reach first. She let Ranger decide. For a long moment, he only stared. Then his nose lowered toward the denim jacket. He smelled the sleeve, then the front, then the place near Emily's shoulder, where the old fabric still held the faintest memory of Daniel. His breathing changed. The tremor passed through him again, but softer now, like a storm moving away. Emily whispered, You found him there, didn't you? Ranger pressed forward. His heavy head came down against her shoulder. Emily wrapped her arms around his neck, careful of the muzzle, careful of the years that had made him flinch from sudden touch. But Ranger did not pull away. He leaned into her with his full weight, as if the strength that had carried him through patrols, searches, loss, and lonely nights had finally run out. A sound came from him, low and broken. Emily held him tighter. You are safe, she said. You are not going back to the river alone. Margaret wiped her eyes. Tom looked toward the ceiling and blinked hard. Luis turned aside, pretending to check the loose lead. Ben cleared his throat and failed to hide the emotion in his face. For the first time in years, Ranger did not scan the doors. He did not search for danger. He did not brace for the next command from a stranger. He rested against Emily, and in that old warehouse at Fairhaven Point, among folded chairs, steel kennels, and the scattered savings of grateful people, a retired police dog finally stopped standing guard over a goodbye. 1 year later, Fairhaven Point had learned to speak Ranger's name with warmth again. Not pity, not fear. Warmth. He lived with Emily in a small white house on a quiet rise above Greystone River. The house had peeling porch rails, 2 stubborn rose bushes by the front steps, and a kitchen window that caught the morning sun. From the porch, the river could be seen between the trees, silver in winter, green in spring, and gold when evening arrived slowly over the town. At first, Emily had worried that living near the river would be too much for him. In the early weeks, Ranger still woke at night, lifting his head at distant rain or the low murmur of water after storms. Sometimes he paced the hallway until Emily sat on the floor with him, one hand on his shoulder, breathing slowly until his breathing followed hers. She never rushed him. She never demanded trust. She remembered what Daniel had once told her. Trust was a bridge, and bridges were built one plank at a time. So they built it. A few steps into the yard. Then a walk to the mailbox. Then a slow path down the hill, stopping whenever Ranger needed to stop. There were setbacks. On windy nights when the river grew loud, he sometimes pressed himself against the back door, as if waiting for Daniel to come through it, soaked and smiling. Once, during a spring storm, he crawled beneath Emily's kitchen table and would not come out for an hour. Emily sat beside him with a blanket around her shoulders and read aloud from an old library book until Ranger's trembling eased. The book was about Greek heroes, which seemed a little grand for a dog hiding from thunder, but Emily told him quietly that even heroes were allowed to dislike bad weather. Ranger blinked at her, unimpressed but calmer. By summer, he began sleeping through the night. By autumn, his coat had filled out again. The gray around his muzzle remained, and the scars did not disappear, but they no longer looked like open chapters of pain. They became part of him, like the worn corners of an old family Bible. His eyes softened. He followed Emily from room to room, not with panic, but with purpose. He learned the rhythm of her life: coffee before sunrise, work at the retired K9 support center, dinner on the porch, quiet evenings with Daniel's old jacket folded over the back of a chair. Emily had changed too. She began volunteering with a small local program called Second Leash, a county-supported group that helped retired working dogs adjust to civilian life. The program was managed by Carla Monroe, a 54-year-old veterinary behavior specialist who believed wounded dogs needed patience before correction. Emily started by cleaning kennels and organizing donated blankets. Then she helped walk older dogs. Eventually, she began speaking with families who wanted to adopt retired K9s but did not understand what those dogs carried home with them. She never claimed to be an expert. She simply told the truth. "Do not ask them to forget," she would say. "Give them somewhere safe to remember." Ranger became the quiet proof beside her. He did not greet every stranger. He did not perform tricks for visitors. He simply lay near Emily's chair during meetings, calm and watchful, his head resting on his paws. People looked at him and understood that healing did not always look like joy at first. Sometimes it looked like an old dog finally sleeping without fear. On the anniversary of Daniel's death, Fairhaven Point gathered beside Greystone River. The town had held memorials before, but this one felt different. It was not only about loss, it was about all that had continued because one man had given everything. White chairs were placed on the grass near Hawthorne Footbridge. A wreath stood beside a framed photograph of Daniel in uniform. 3 small lanterns rested near the riverbank, one for each child he had saved. Emily arrived with Ranger at her side. He wore a simple leather collar now, not a tactical harness. Daniel's old badge number had been engraved on a small brass tag. Ranger walked slowly, shoulder close to Emily's leg, but he did not pull away from the sound of the river. His ears moved at the rush of water. His body tightened once. Emily felt it through the leash and stopped. "We can wait," she whispered. Ranger looked toward the river. Then he took another step. Margaret was already there, sitting in the front row with a folded blanket over her lap. Beside her stood Noah Ellis, now 17, tall and quiet, wearing the Navy jacket of a volunteer emergency medical program. The 2 other children Daniel had saved were there as well. Lily Harper, 16 years old, a high school student who now taught younger children basic water safety, held a small bouquet of white daisies. Caleb Ross, 18 years old, a community college freshman studying fire science, carried 3 red roses tied with twine. They had all grown taller than the memories people kept of them, but each carried the same truth. Their lives had continued. When Emily saw them together, something inside her ached and healed at the same time. Noah stepped forward first. He looked at Ranger with careful respect. "Hi, Ranger," he said. Ranger sniffed the air, then lowered his head slightly. Noah smiled, but his eyes filled. "I don't remember everything from that day. I remember cold water. I remember shouting. And I remember a dog barking like he was trying to hold the whole world together." Margaret placed a hand over her mouth. Lily came next and set her daisies beside Daniel's photograph. "My mother says Captain Walker carried me like I weighed nothing," she said softly. "I was old enough to be scared, but not old enough to understand what it cost." Caleb laid down the roses. "I understand now." No one rushed the silence that followed. Tom stood near the wreath, his posture straighter than usual, as if standing for Daniel one more time. Roy, Marcia, Ruth, Frank, Helen, Luis, and Ben were there too. People who had given money at the auction stood among people who had not been there, but wished they had. The town had gathered not as an audience, but as witnesses. Emily knelt beside Ranger and unclipped the leash. A few people shifted nervously out of old habit, but Ranger did not move wildly. He stood still, looking at the river. The Greystone moved calmly that day, touched by sunlight, its surface broken by soft ripples. It did not look like a monster. It looked like water again. Emily rested her hand on Ranger's back. "You can go if you want." For a long moment, Ranger did nothing. Then he walked forward. Step by step, he moved down the grassy bank until his front paws touched the damp earth near the water. His body trembled once, but he did not retreat. He lowered his head and looked into the river, breathing slowly. Emily stood a few feet behind him, tears moving quietly down her face. Ranger did not bark. He did not search the current. He did not throw himself toward a ghost. He simply stood there, old and scarred and brave in a gentler way, as if he had finally understood that Daniel was not waiting beneath the water. Daniel was in the lives standing behind him, in Noah's future hands helping the injured, in Lily teaching children to respect the river, in Caleb choosing fire service, in Emily's steady voice, in the town that had not forgotten. After a while, Ranger turned away from the river and walked back to Emily. She knelt, and he pressed his head against her chest. The memorial ended with 3 lanterns set gently on the water. They drifted downstream, small lights against the afternoon current, not fighting the river, not fearing it, simply moving on. That evening, Ranger lay on Emily's front porch while the sun lowered behind Fairhaven Point. The river glowed through the trees, quiet and golden. Emily sat beside him with Daniel's denim jacket over her knees, one hand resting in Ranger's fur. The old dog sighed, deep and peaceful. For years he had guarded a goodbye. Now he guarded a home. And in Fairhaven Point, people still told the story of Captain Daniel Walker, the officer who entered the river for 3 children, and Ranger, the loyal K9 who loved him enough to follow. They told it not because it was sad, though it was. They told it because love, when it is true, does not end at the water's edge. It keeps walking beside those who remain, steady as a faithful dog at sunset. This story reminds us that loyalty does not end when duty ends, and love does not disappear simply because someone is gone. Captain Daniel Walker gave his life to save 3 children, but the kindness he left behind continued to live through Emily, through Ranger, and through every person in Fairhaven Point who chose to remember. Ranger was not just a retired police dog. He was a wounded heart carrying the memory of the man he loved most. Sometimes those who seem broken are not beyond saving. They are only waiting for someone patient enough to understand their pain. And sometimes a community does not heal by forgetting what happened, but by standing together and honoring what love made possible. In the end, Ranger did not just come home to Emily. He came home to peace. What do you think about Emily and Ranger's journey? Have you ever seen an animal remember love so deeply? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below.